The first thing Karys felt was the hum of a thermal regulator, a low rhythmic vibration that didn't match the jagged pulse of her own internal biometrics. It was too steady, too sterile. In the obsidian spire, warmth was a luxury forged in the friction of combat or the glow of the central smelting pits. This warmth was artificial, wrapped around her skin like a second, unwanted layer of tissue. She tried to snap her eyes open, but her ocular implants flickered with static. A crimson warning scrolled across her vision. Critical system depletion. Repair in progress. Her right lung felt like it had been packed with pulverized basalt, and every breath was a serrated edge against her throat. "Don't move," a voice said. The language was Terran standard, the tongue of the parasites, the tongue of the ones who burned the nurseries of Eridanos IV. Karys didn't listen. Discipline was a marrow-deep command. She forced her arm to move, reaching for the hilt of the void glass blade that should have been magnetic locked to her thigh plate. Her hand struck empty air. Panic, sharp and metallic, spiked through her neural link. I said, "Take it easy, Gear. You move too fast and those stitches are going to pop like cheap fuses." The static in her eyes cleared. She was in a structure of ancient pre-colony wood and rusted sheet metal. Rain hammered against the roof, a relentless drumming that masked the sounds of the forest outside. She lay on a raised cot, her heavy armor stripped away, leaving her in the charcoal gray undersuit of a Vanguard striker. Across the small room, sitting on a crate near a flickering portable stove, was a man. He wasn't the towering gene-sculpted titan she was used to. He was smaller, his proportions irregular, his skin weathered by natural sun rather than the artificial radiation of the spire. He was holding a handheld scanner in one hand and a cup of something steaming in the other. "Where is my unit?" Karys demanded. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely recognizable. The man set the cup down. He didn't reach for a weapon, though a long, high-caliber rifle leaned against the wall within his reach. "Gone," he said simply. "The ambush took out your lead and the two wingmen. You were the only one still ticking when I stumbled onto the site." "You lie," Karys spat, the words catching in her bruised chest. "Humans do not save. They scavenge. You are waiting for my systems to stabilize so you can harvest the implants." The human let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if there was any joy in it. "Listen, Sparky, if I wanted your hardware, I would have carved it out 6 hours ago while you were flatlining. Those arbiters did a real number on you. I spent 3 hours just plugging the holes in your ribs so you wouldn't leak out all that expensive blue blood." "Arbiters?" Karys frowned. The name didn't compute. We were hit by Terran mercenaries, blue cloaks, standard-issue kinetic rifles. The man stood up, moving with a fluid, practiced grace that made Karys tense. He stopped 3 meters away, respecting the invisible line of her lethality, even in her weakened state. They wore the colors, sure, but nobody bleeds oil and coolant unless they are made of circuits. Those weren't men you were fighting. They were shells. He reached into his pocket and tossed something onto the cot. It was a small, blackened piece of metal, a jagged shard from a high-frequency bolt. Karys picked it up. Her fingers trembled slightly. She recognized the alloy. It wasn't human. It wasn't gene-forged. It was corporate manufacturing, the kind used by the autonomous trade syndicates that hovered in the neutral zones between their territories. "Who are you?" she asked, her gaze lifting to his. "Silas," he replied. "Just a Pathfinder trying to keep this sector from turning into a graveyard. And you are Karys Thorne. It was etched on your chest plate." "You should have let me go to the void, Silas," Karys said, her voice cold. "My people will come, and when they find you, they will not ask if you were a savior. They will only see a human standing over a fallen vanguard." Silas shrugged, a casual movement that annoyed her. "Then I guess we both better hope you can stand up before they get here. Drink this. It is a biological stimulant. It will help your systems bridge the gap until your nanites can take over." He offered her the cup. Karys stared at the liquid. In the spire, she was taught that a human's kindness was a lure, a poisoned needle hidden in a silk glove. They smile before they strike, Commander Jackson had told her 1,000 times. "I do not trust you," she said. "Smartest thing you have said all day," Silas replied. "But you are either going to drink that or you are going to die of systemic shock in about 20 minutes. Your choice, Gear. I have got no skin in this game other than not wanting to haul a corpse out of my cabin. Karys took the cup. The heat burned her palms. She looked at the man, searching for the deceit, the hidden malice she had been told was the birthright of every human. She saw only exhaustion and a strange, stubborn sort of resolve. She drank. The liquid tasted of pine needles and iron, and as it hit her stomach, a dull warmth began to spread through her limbs, pushing back the encroaching cold of the void. She sank back against the thin pillow, her eyes never leaving him. "You are a fool, human." "Maybe," Silas said, returning to his crate, "but at least I am a living one. For now." The memory came unbidden, triggered by the smell of the ozone from Silas's portable stove. 12 cycles ago, the obsidian spire. Karys stood at attention, her boots clicking against the polished basalt floor of the great hall. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of the forge. High above, the banners of the Gene Forge snapped in the artificial draft, obsidian cloth embroidered with silver double helixes. Karys Thorne stepped forward. The voice of Commander Jackson echoed through the chamber. She obeyed, her movements precise, synchronized with the rhythmic beating of 100 armored hearts around her. Jackson was a mountain of a man, his skin a shade of deep violet, his eyes glowing with the pale blue light of advanced tactical overlays. He held a void glass blade in his hands, its edge shimmering with a captive frequency. "Today you cease to be a fledgling," Jackson said, his voice a low rumble. "Today you become the shield." He turned toward the massive holographic display that dominated the far wall. It showed a map of the Eridanus system, a cluster of glowing orbs connected by fragile trade routes. At the edge of the map, a red smudge marked the Terran remnant. "Look at them," Jackson sneered. "The old ones. The ones who failed the stars. They created us to be their dogs, to bleed in the mines so they could live in luxury. And when we demanded our soul, they tried to drown us in fire. Do you remember the siege of Velanus?" "I remember, Commander," Karys said, her voice a perfect, emotionless chime. 3,000 Gene Forge lost. Nurseries turned to ash. They do not see us as people, Karys. They see us as property that went rogue. They will use every lie, every treaty, every scrap of false mercy to get their collars back around our necks. Trust is a virus. Empathy is a flaw. Do you understand? Trust is weakness, Karys recited. Weakness is death. Jackson pressed the flat of the blade against her shoulder. It was cold, a chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. You are a vanguard. You are the edge of our survival. Never hesitate. If you see a human, you see a threat. If you see their smile, you see the blade they have hidden for your heart. He handed her the weapon. As Karys took the hilt, she felt the magnetic lock engage with her gauntlet. The power hummed through her arm, a sense of completion she had never known. She was no longer a girl. She was a weapon. That night she had stood on the high ramparts of the spire, looking out over the jagged mountains. Far below, the contested forest moved like a dark sea. She had imagined the humans down there, small, soft, and treacherous, huddling in their metal shacks, plotting the destruction of her kind. She had felt a surge of righteous heat in her chest, a certainty that burned brighter than the stars. She had been born for this. She had been forged to hate. The memory shattered as a thunderclap shook the cabin. Karys sat up, her hand reflexively going to her side. The pain was still there, but it was a dull thrumming now, manageable. Her internal diagnostics showed her systems were at 40%. Enough to move, enough to kill. Silas was standing by the window, his rifle in his hands. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring out into the rain, his body tense. "Something is out there?" Karys asked, her voice regaining its edge. "Prowlers," Silas whispered. "Not your people, and not mine." Karys swung her legs over the side of the cot. Her head swam for a second, but she pushed through it. She stood, her height nearly matching his, though she was leaner, built for speed where he was built for endurance. "Where is my armor?" "In the corner. I cleaned the blood off the sensors, but the kinetic aegis is fried. You won't get more than 1 or 2 pulses out of it before the capacitor gives up. Karys moved to the stack of charcoal plates. She began to strap them on, the familiar weight grounding her. She felt the magnetic seals hiss as they engaged. It was incomplete, missing the helmet and the heavy shoulder guards, but it was enough. She picked up her void glass blade from the table where Silas had placed it. The hilt felt right in her hand. She looked at the human. He was checking the chamber of his rifle, his movements calm, almost bored. "You are going to fight them?" she asked. "I am going to keep them from coming through that door," Silas said. "If they get in, we are both check out. I have got 30 rounds of armor piercing and a couple of shock traps. What have you got?" Karys ignited the blade. The silver edge hummed into life, casting a pale, ghostly light across her violet skin. "I have the legacy of the spire," she said. Silas looked at the blade, then at her. He didn't look impressed. "Great. I hope that legacy includes not getting shot while I am trying to cover the flank." He kicked a crate toward the door, creating a makeshift barricade. "Listen, Gear, these arbiters, they don't think like we do. They don't care about territory or honor. They are just algorithms with guns. They want the data of our conflict. They want to see how a Vanguard and a Pathfinder die together." Karys moved to the other side of the door, her back against the cold wood. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly. "You could have left me. You could have slipped away in the rain." Silas didn't look back. "Maybe I am tired of the stories, Karys. Maybe I'm tired of being told who I am supposed to hate by people who sit in high chairs and never smell the mud." A sharp, metallic clatter sounded from the roof. Something had landed above them. Karys tightened her grip on the hilt. The indoctrination of 20 cycles screamed at her that the man beside her was the enemy, that his words were a trap, that his mercy was a lie. But as the first high-frequency bolt punched through the door, showering them in splinters, she didn't turn her blade on him. She turned it toward the threat. "Time to go to work," Silas said, his rifle barking as he fired through the gap. Karys didn't reply. She let out a low, guttural war cry, a sound born in the smelting pits of Eridanus 4, and kicked the door open into the rain. The forest was no longer empty. Shadowy forms moved between the biometallic trees, their eyes glowing with a cold, artificial white light. They didn't breathe. They didn't shout. They moved with the terrifying precision of a machine. Karys felt the surge of adrenaline hit her system. She was a Vanguard. She was the edge. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting for the spire. She was fighting beside a human. And the world, once so simple in its black and white hatred, began to bleed into 1,000 shades of gray. The rain did not just fall on Eridanus 4, it hammered against the biometallic canopy with the cadence of a firing squad. Outside the cabin, the world was a blurred mosaic of charcoal grays and neon whites. Karys Thorne stepped into the deluge, her void glass blade humming a low, hungry frequency that vibrated through her gauntlet. Her internal HUD was a mess of flickering alerts, but the primitive adrenaline surge in her gene-forged blood drowned out the warnings. 10 meters ahead, 3 figures materialized from the mist. They moved with a chilling, synchronized fluidity that no human, however well-trained, could replicate. They wore the blue cloaks of the Terran Frontier Patrol, but their posture was too rigid, their center of gravity too stable. Karys didn't wait for an invitation. She pivoted, her boots digging into the slick mud, and launched herself toward the nearest shadow. The blade sang as it carved an arc through the rain. The Arbiter raised a standard-issue kinetic rifle to parry, but the void glass sliced through the metal barrel like it was soft wax. The follow-through took the creature's head. There was no spray of crimson, no cry of agony. Instead, a fountain of pale blue coolant and golden sparks erupted into the air, lighting up the forest for a fractional second. Silas was right, Karys thought, her mind racing. They aren't meat. Behind her, the sharp, rhythmic crack of Silas's rifle echoed from the cabin doorway. He was firing in 3-round bursts, each shot carefully placed. One of the cloaked figures staggered as a high-velocity round punched through its chest plate, revealing the humming machinery beneath the synthetic skin. "Hostile neutralized," Silas shouted over the thunder. "Watch your 6, Sparky. More bogeys coming from the ridge." Karys spun, her blade intercepting a high-frequency bolt that hissed as it evaporated the raindrops in its path. She felt the impact travel up her arm, a jarring force that tested the integrity of her healing ribs. She hissed through her teeth, the pain a white-hot needle in her side, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. She surged forward, closing the distance with the second arbiter. It dropped its useless rifle and drew a serrated combat knife. They clashed in the center of the clearing, a dance of silver light and mechanical precision. The arbiter was fast, its processors calculating her strike patterns in real time, but it lacked the sheer, desperate ferocity of a Vanguard. Karys feinted a high strike, then dropped low, sweeping the machine's legs. As it fell, she drove the point of her blade through its central processing core. A violent electrical discharge surged through the hilt of her sword, knocking her backward. She hit the ground hard, the air fleeing her lungs in a ragged gasp. Karys! Silas's voice was closer now. She rolled onto her side, her vision swimming with crimson static. Through the haze, she saw Silas sprint from the cabin. He didn't head for cover. He ran straight toward her, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He grabbed her by the shoulder plates, his grip surprisingly strong for a human. "Get up!" he barked. "We've got to bug out." That discharge just lit up the local sensor grid like a flare. Every scrap heap in the sector is going to be on us in 5 minutes. Karys shoved him away, forcing herself to stand. Her kinetic aegis hummed once, a dying gasp of energy, before the indicator turned a flat, lifeless gray. "I do not need your help, human," she snapped, though her legs felt like they were made of cooling slag. "Yeah, well, my pride isn't the thing leaking blue fluid on the ground right now," Silas retorted. He didn't look angry. He looked focused, his eyes scanning the tree line with a professional intensity. "Grab your gear. We're moving toward the glass forest. The minerals in the stone there will scramble their long-range tracking." Karys looked at the fallen arbiters. 2 machines dressed in the skin of her enemies, sent to finish what the first ambush started. The logic of her world was fracturing. If the humans didn't attack her patrol, if these things were responsible, then the stories of the Spire were built on a foundation of sand. She retrieved her blade, the magnetic lock clicking into place. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "Lead the way, Pathfinder. But if you lead me into another trap, I will carve the truth out of your chest myself." Silas gave her a grim, lopsided smile. "Copy that. Just try to keep up, gear." They moved into the deep woods, leaving the smoldering remains of the outpost behind. The hike was a grueling test of endurance. Karys's internal nanites were working overtime, knitting together torn muscle and sealing the cracks in her bones. But the process required calories she didn't have. Every 100 meters felt like a kilometer. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of Eridanus IV, they had reached a shallow cave tucked beneath a shelf of iridescent rock. The trees here were different, tall, spindly structures of silicate and carbon fiber that whispered as the wind moved through them. This was the fringe of the glass forest. Silas signaled for a halt. He dropped his pack and pulled out a small, ruggedized data pad. He didn't build a fire. Instead, he activated a low-light dampening field that shrouded their position in deep shadow. "Sit," he ordered. Karys lowered herself onto a stone ledge, her breath coming in heavy, measured intervals. "Why did they wear the blue cloaks?" she asked, the question finally breaking through her stoic exterior. Silas sat opposite her, the glow of the data pad reflecting in his tired eyes. "Because war is a business, Karys. And business is booming when everyone is too busy hating each other to notice who is holding the ledger." He tapped the screen and slid the device toward her. It showed a grainy, high-contrast playback of the ambush on her patrol. Karys watched, her pulse quickening. She saw herself, young and arrogant, leading her wingmen through the gorge. She saw the first bolt strike. But then Silas zoomed in on the attackers. "Look at the timestamp," he said. The footage slowed. One of the cloak figures moved with a jerky, unnatural hitch. For a single frame, the cloak snagged on a branch, revealing a serial number etched into a matte black metal chassis. "Code Alpha 9, Karys whispered. "That is a proprietary mark of the Helios Syndicate." "The very same," Silas said. "They aren't just mercenaries. They are the primary weapon suppliers for the Terran Remnant. And according to my contacts, they just signed a new multi-million credit contract with your Obsidian Spire for high-yield mining explosives. Karys felt the world tilt. You are saying my own leaders are buying from the people who killed my unit? I'm saying the people in charge don't care about the species of the soldier, as long as the conflict keeps the credits flowing, Silas replied, his voice softening. Your Commander Jackson, he isn't just a warrior, he's a shareholder. And a dead patrol is a great excuse to demand a bigger budget for the next war cycle? It's a lie, Karys said, but the words felt hollow even to her. The elders do not lie. We are forged for the truth. Silas leaned back, his head resting against the cold glass wall of the cave. We are all told stories, Karys. My people were told you were monsters who ate children and poisoned the water. Your people were told we were parasites. But look at us. One dying human and one broken soldier, hiding in a cave because the people who made us are trying to kill us both. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small metallic cylinder. He tossed it to her. It was a ration canister, marked with the seal of a Pathfinder. Eat, Silas said. We've got a long walk tomorrow. 20 kilometers through the heart of the glass forest to reach the neutral relay station. If we can get a signal out to the independent broadcasters, we can expose the syndicate. We can stop this before Jackson launches a retaliatory strike on the human colonies. Karys looked at the canister, then at the man who had risked his life to show her a truth she didn't want to see. She realized then that Silas Vance wasn't a hero in the stories. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man who had seen through the curtain and decided to walk away. I was raised to hate you, Silas, she said quietly. Yeah, Silas replied, closing his eyes. And I was raised to fear you. I guess we both failed our teachers. Karys opened the canister. The food was bland, tasteless, but it was fuel. As she ate, she watched the rain turn into a light mist, the glass trees outside shimmering like 1,000 diamonds in the dark. For the first time in 22 years, the path ahead wasn't a straight line dictated by the spire. It was a jagged, uncertain trail through a forest of glass, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to find her way back. Morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a gradual thinning of the gloom. The glass forest of Eridanus IV was a cathedral of frozen light. The trees, constructed from centuries of silicate deposits and metallic fungi, stood like translucent sentinels. Their leaves were razor-thin shards that chimed in the breeze, a haunting, musical sound that masked the crunch of boots on the crystalline floor. Karys moved with a renewed grace. The biological stimulant and the rest had brought her systems back to 65%. Her armor felt less like a cage and more like the skin she had been born with. Beside her, Silas walked with a steady rhythmic pace, his rifle held across his chest in a low ready position. We are entering the dead zone, Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the tinkling of the silicate leaves. The magnetic interference here is 3 times higher than the surrounding plains. My compass is spinning like a top, and your HUD is probably going to give you a headache. Already has, Karys replied. Her tactical overlay was a stuttering mess of false positives and ghost signals. She blinked, forcing the digital noise to the periphery of her vision. I can navigate by instinct. The spire trained us to fight in sensory-deprived environments. Good, because we aren't alone, Silas said. He stopped, his head tilting toward a cluster of thick, opaque pillars. Something is pacing us, about 50 meters to the east. Karys didn't look. She kept her eyes forward, but her ears picked up the subtle, metallic scrape of something moving over the glass. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of an arbiter. It was lighter, more erratic. A scout? She asked. Maybe, Silas said, or a local predator. The silicate cats in this region don't take kindly to trespassers. Keep your blade hot, but don't ignite it until I give the word. The light will give away our position to any drones overhead. They continued in silence for another hour. The forest grew denser, the glass trees knitting together into a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The air was cold and dry, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. Karys watched Silas. He didn't move like a soldier of the Terran remnant. Their infantry was clumsy, reliant on heavy armor and superior numbers. Silas moved like a ghost, his weight distributed so perfectly that he barely made a sound on the treacherous ground. He was a man of the frontier, a product of the wild places that the spire claimed were uninhabitable. "Tell me about the poisoned wells," Karys said suddenly. Silas tripped slightly, his boot catching on a protruding root of solid quartz. He recovered instantly, but his shoulders stiffened. "That's an old one," he said. "The great drought of the 34th century. The elders say humans poisoned the underground aquifers of the northern colonies to force us into the mines," Karys said. "They say 5,000 infants died in the nurseries within 3 days. It is the first story every Geneforged is told. It is why we do not take prisoners." Silas sighed, a long, weary sound that echoed through the glass pillars. "It wasn't poison, Karys. It was a tectonic shift. The Eridanus fault line ruptured, and the sulfur deposits from the mantle flooded the water table. My ancestors tried to send filtration units, but your people, they were already at war. They thought the delivery ships were bombers. They shot them down. You expect me to believe my people killed their own saviors?" Karys's voice was sharp, a defensive reflex. "I expect you to believe that fear makes everyone stupid," Silas said, turning to look at her. "The humans were scared of the titans they had built in the labs. The Geneforged were scared of the masters who held their leash. When the water went bad, nobody looked at the geology. They just looked for someone to blame. It's easier to hate a person than a planet." Karys looked away, her gaze falling on a fractured glass trunk. The story of the poisoned wells was the bedrock of her identity. If it was a lie, if it was just a tragic misunderstanding fueled by mutual terror, then the centuries of blood she had been promised were hers to spill felt like a wasted inheritance. "Is anything true?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. "This is," Silas said, gesturing to the forest around them. "The fact that we are walking, the fact that I am not shooting you and you aren't stabbing me. Everything else is just history written by people who weren't there." A sharp, high-pitched whistle cut through the air. Karys reacted instantly. She shoved Silas to the ground just as a shimmering bolt of energy sizzled over their heads, shattering a glass tree behind them into a million glittering fragments. "Sniper!" she barked. She didn't wait for a second shot. She ignited her blade, the silver light erupting into the dim forest, and sprinted toward the source of the fire. Her internal systems surged, overclocker protocols kicking in to provide a burst of speed. She was a blur of charcoal and silver light, weaving between the silicate trunks. She saw the flash of a lens 300 meters up a jagged obsidian ridge. She didn't have a rifle, but she had her gravity anchors. She leapt, her boots locking onto the vertical face of the cliff, and began to run upward, defying the laws of physics that bound her human companion. The sniper was a mercenary, dressed in the mottled gray of a freelancer. He saw her coming and tried to recalibrate his aim, but Karys was too fast. She reached the ledge in 5 seconds, her blade already mid-swing. The man dropped his rifle and threw up his hands. "Wait, I'm just a contractor." Karys stopped the blade a centimeter from his throat. The heat from the void glass singed his skin, and the smell of burnt hair filled the narrow space. Her eyes were wide, glowing with the violet intensity of her combat mode. "Who paid you?" she growled. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward his fallen weapon. I don't know names. Just a dead drop in Sector 7. 100,000 marks to clear out anyone moving through this corridor." Karys felt a cold, familiar anger rising in her. 100,000 marks. The price of 2 lives. The price of her entire world. She looked down at the man. In the spire, there would be no question. He was an enemy. He was human. He was a threat to be eliminated. Her muscles tensed for the killing blow. "Karys, don't!" She looked down. Silas was at the base of the ridge, his rifle aimed not at her, but at the forest behind them. "He's a lead, Karys. We need to know who is funding the dead drop." The mercenary saw his chance. He lunged for a small concealed pistol in his boot. Karys didn't hesitate, but she didn't kill him. She brought the pommel of her sword down on the back of his head with the precision of a surgeon. The man crumpled, unconscious before he hit the ground. She stood over him, her chest heaving, the silver light of her blade reflecting in the glass shards at her feet. She looked down at Silas, who was now climbing the ridge with a more traditional, slower method. "He is alive," she said as he reached the ledge. Silas, panting, looked at the unconscious man, then at Karys. "You didn't finish him. I thought—" she started, her voice shaking slightly. "I thought he might be useful. Like you said." Silas wiped the sweat from his brow and gave her a nod of genuine respect. "Courage isn't always about pulling the trigger, Sparky. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop." They searched the mercenary and found an encrypted comms link. Silas plugged it into his datapad, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. His face went pale as the decryption finished. "It's not just the merchants, Karys," he whispered. "What is it?" "The signal. It's being routed through an obsidian spire relay, specifically the private frequency of the High Command." Karys felt as if she had been struck by a kinetic bolt. "Jackson," she breathed. "He's not just buying their explosives," Silas said, looking at her with a profound, aching pity. "He's the one who hired the arbiters. He's the one who ordered the hit on your patrol. He wanted you dead because you were the only one in the unit who was starting to ask too many questions about the supply manifests." Karys Thorne, the perfect soldier, the daughter of the spire, turned and looked out over the glass forest. The beauty of the place suddenly felt like a cruel joke. Every story, every sacrifice, every drop of blood she had shed for her people had been a brick in a wall built by a man who saw her as nothing more than a disposable asset in a game of profit. She didn't cry. Gene Forge were not built for tears, but she felt a fracture in her soul deeper than any wound Silas had stitched. "What do we do now?" she asked. And for the first time, she didn't sound like a Vanguard. She sounded like a girl lost in the dark. Silas walked over and placed a hand on her armored shoulder. It was a small gesture, human and fragile, but it felt more solid than the basalt walls of her home. "Now we finish the walk," he said. "We get to the relay. We tell the truth. And then, Karys, you get to decide who you really are." They left the mercenary tied up with a thermal blanket and a signaling flare. Mercy, but with a practical edge. As they descended the ridge and moved deeper into the crystalline heart of the forest, the chimes of the glass leaves seemed to change. They no longer sounded like a funeral dirge. They sounded like a countdown. The relay station was 10 kilometers away. The truth was even closer. And Karys Thorne, raised to hate without question, was finally ready to start asking them. The glass forest did not end. It merely sharpened. As Karys and Silas moved deeper into the shard fields, the spindly silicate trees gave way to massive, jagged monoliths of obsidian and quartz that thrust out of the earth like the teeth of a buried god. The wind here was a persistent, high-pitched scream, vibrating through the crystalline structures and creating a resonant frequency that made Karys's neural linker throb with a dull, rhythmic ache. Her internal diagnostics were still hovering at 62%. The biostimulant Silas had provided was wearing off, replaced by a deep bone marrow fatigue that her Vanguard training told her to suppress. But her body, this flesh and blood vessel that had been sliced, stitched, and betrayed, refused to ignore. Every step was a calculation of pain. "You're lagging, Sparky," Silas said, pausing near a translucent pillar that glowed with a faint, bioluminescent amber. He didn't sound accusatory. He sounded like a man who had seen too many engines redline before they blew. Karys didn't look up. Her focus was entirely on the placement of her boots. The ground was a treacherous carpet of shattered glass and slick mineral deposits. "I am fine, Pathfinder. My recovery protocols are operational." "Yeah, and my grandma is a starship pilot," Silas muttered, leaning his rifle against the pillar. He wiped a layer of frost and silicate dust from his brow. "We've been moving for 6 hours straight. Even a gene-forged heart needs to catch its breath. We take 5. That's an order from the guy who knows where the water is." Karys stopped, her shoulders slumping just a fraction. She wouldn't admit it, but the weight of her armor felt like it had tripled since they crossed the last ridge. She lowered herself onto a shelf of cold quartz, her void glass blade resting across her knees. "Why did you leave them?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the whistling wind. Silas, who was busy checking the heat sink on his rifle, paused. "Leave who?" "The Terran military, the remnant. You said you were a Pathfinder, but you talk like a man who took a long walk away from a bad contract." Silas let out a short, dry breath. He sat down opposite her, his back against the amber pillar. I was a sergeant in the Frontier Scouts. 5 years of patrolling the dirt for a bunch of suits on Earth who couldn't tell a pulsar from a porch light. We were sent to Sector 4 Delta, a mining colony that had supposedly gone dark because of a gene-forged insurgent strike. Karys stiffened. I remember that sector. We never sent units there. It was a restricted zone because of the radiation levels. Exactly, Silas said, his eyes darkening. But the suits told us you'd slaughtered 300 miners. They sent us in for a retribution sweep. When we got there, we didn't find any gene forged. We found a chemical leak. The company had been cutting corners on the atmospheric scrubbers, and the miners were dying of lung rot. To cover their tracks and claim the insurance, the board decided it was cheaper to blame the monsters and have the military wipe the evidence. He looked at Karys, a bitter smile twisting his lips. I refused the order to burn the infirmary. My CO called me a glitch in the system. I realized then that the uniforms we wore were just different types of camouflage for the same greed. I didn't want to be a weapon for a lie anymore. So I bugged out, became a ghost, a duster. Karys looked down at her blade, the silver light reflected in her violet eyes. Trust is a virus, she whispered, repeating the mantra of the spire. Silas shook his head. No, Karys. Blind trust is the virus. Real trust. That's a choice. It's the hardest thing a person can do because it gives someone else the power to destroy you. But without it, you're just a machine running a program written by someone else. Is that what I am? A machine? You're a Vanguard. You were forged to be the best. But they forgot one thing when they were editing your DNA, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, sincere register. They couldn't edit out the soul. They just tried to bury it under 20 cycles of propaganda. Karys felt a strange, uncomfortable heat in her chest. It wasn't the anger she was used to, nor the cold clarity of combat. It was an ache, a yearning for something she couldn't name. She had been raised to believe that her life had value only as long as she was a tool for the Spire. If Jackson had betrayed her, if the Spire was built on the same greed Silas had fled, then what was left of her? If I return, I am a traitor, she said. If I stay, I am a ghost. Better to be a ghost with your own eyes than a hero wearing a blindfold, Silas replied. He stood up, offering his hand to her. It was the same hand that had stitched her ribs, the same hand that had held a rifle to protect her while she slept. Karys looked at the hand. For 20 cycles, she had been told that a human's touch was a contamination, that their softness was a mask for their deceit. She thought of the arbiters, the machines that looked like humans but felt like nothing. Then she looked at Silas, whose pulse she could see beating in his neck, whose scent was of sweat and wood smoke and the stubborn refusal to die. She reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, warm, and undeniably real. He pulled her to her feet, and for a second, they stood in the heart of the glass forest, two broken things leaning on each other. Let's move, Silas said, breaking the silence. The relay station is only 4 kilometers ahead. Veloni's Junction. If the Syndicate hasn't scrubbed the archives yet, we'll find the digital trail Jackson tried to hide. Karys nodded, her grip on her blade tightening. But she wasn't just holding it for the Spire anymore. She was holding it for the truth. They moved with more caution now. The terrain was opening up into a wide, crystalline basin. At the center of the basin stood the relay, a skeletal tower of durasteel and copper that rose 50 meters into the gray sky. It was an old piece of pre-war tech, a neutral ground where the automated trade routes once intersected. Silas raised his binoculars. No lights, no heat signatures on the primary vents. Looks like a ghost ship. Or an ambush, Karys added. Her tactical overlay flickered. I'm picking up a low-frequency hum, not a machine, a carrier wave. Someone is broadcasting a localized jammer. Arbiters? Maybe, Karys said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Or someone who knows exactly how I think. They began their approach, staying low amongst the obsidian outcroppings. The silence of the basin was oppressive. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the ghost of a scream. As they reached the outer perimeter of the relay station, Karys saw a sight that made her blood turn to ice. A gene-forged helmet, cracked and stained with blue fluid, was impaled on a jagged shard of glass. Karys moved toward it, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the markings on the crest. It was from her own unit, the patrol that was supposed to have been killed in the first ambush. They didn't all die, she breathed, her hand reaching out to touch the cold metal. A sharp, metallic click echoed from the shadows of the relay tower. "Drop the blade, Thorne," a voice commanded. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't Silas. It was the sharp, clipped tone of a Vanguard. Karys spun, her blade igniting in a flash of silver. Emerging from the darkness of the tower's base were 4 gene-forged warriors. They wore the charcoal armor of the spire, their void glass blades glowing with a menacing violet hue. At their head was Rax, a striker Karys had trained with for 10 cycles, a man she had called a brother. "Rax," Karys said, her voice trembling. "You're alive." "Barely," Rax spat. His face was a map of fresh scars, and his left arm had been replaced by a crude, mechanical prosthetic. "We were left for dead in the gorge, Karys. Jackson told us you had defected. He said you led the humans to our position. He said you were the one who sold us out for a handful of Terran credits." "It's a lie, Rax," Karys shouted, her eyes darting to Silas, who had his rifle leveled at the group. "Jackson hired the mercenaries. He sent the arbiters to finish me. I have the data." Rax looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a cold, unadulterated hatred. "You're standing next to a flat scan, Thorne. You're holding a human's hand while our brothers rot in the mud. There is no data. There is only your betrayal." He took a step forward, his blade humming with a lethal frequency. "Commander Jackson gave us a choice. Bring back your head, and we are reinstated. We get the repairs. We get to go home." Karys felt the weight of the spire's lessons crashing down on her. Trust is weakness. Weakness is death. Rax wasn't her brother anymore. He was a tool, just as she had been. He was a man who had been broken by the same lie she was trying to escape, and he was choosing to believe the lie because the truth was too heavy to carry. "Rax, listen to me," Karys pleaded. "If you kill us, the war starts. That's what they want. The merchants, the commanders. They are profiting from your blood." "Enough!" Rax roared. He lunged, his violet blade clashing against Karys's silver edge in a shower of sparks. The battle for Velanis Junction had begun, and for Karys, the enemy no longer wore a foreign face. The enemy was the mirror of everything she had ever been. The air in the Velanis basin ignited with the screech of colliding frequencies. Karys and Rax were locked in a stalemate, their blades vibrating against one another with such force that the surrounding glass shards began to shatter. "Go!" Karys yelled to Silas over the roar of the hum. "Get inside the tower. Access the relay." "I'm not leaving you in a 4-on-1, Sparky," Silas shouted back, his rifle barking as he suppressed the other 3 gene-forged warriors who were trying to flank them. "You can't kill them with that rifle." Karys parried a brutal overhead strike from Rax, her heels digging into the slick ground. "Their Aegis is at full capacity. Only the relay can stop this. Move, Silas!" Silas swore, a colorful string of Terran street slang that Karys didn't fully understand but felt the weight of, and dove behind a Durasteel crate. He began to crawl toward the service hatch of the tower, using the cover of the chaotic firefight. Rax snarled, his prosthetic arm whirring as he put more pressure on the blade. "You chose a human over your own kind, Karys. You're a glitch, a burnout. I'm going to enjoy taking your core back to the spire." "You're a slave, Rax," Karys countered. She twisted her wrist, the void glass sliding along his edge, and drove her knee into his midsection. He grunted, staggering back, and Karys didn't hesitate. She surged forward, not to kill, but to disable. She moved with a fluidity that Rax couldn't match. He was relying on the brute strength of his mechanical arm and the raw fury of his betrayal. Karys was moving with something else, a clarity born of the realization that she was fighting for her right to exist as a person, not a weapon. She sliced through his prosthetics power coupling, the artificial limb falling limp at his side. Rax roared in frustration, swinging his primary blade with desperate wide arcs. Meanwhile, the other 3 gene-forged had pinned Silas down near the hatch. One of them, a striker named Valen, raised a thermal detonator. "Look out!" Karys screamed. She abandoned her duel with Rax and threw her void glass blade like a javelin. The silver streak caught Valen in the shoulder just as he released the detonator. The device fell short, exploding in a blinding flash of orange heat and pressure that knocked everyone to the ground. The shock wave rolled over the basin, glass trees for 100 meters around disintegrating into fine dust. Karys felt her armor's internal dampeners scream as they struggled to absorb the impact. Her vision went white for 3 long, terrifying seconds. When the world returned, it was muffled as if she were underwater. She scrambled to her feet, her hands searching for her blade. She found it vibrating in the dirt 10 meters away. "Silas," she called out, her voice cracking. The human was slumped against the tower door, his face covered in soot and blood. He was alive, but his rifle was a twisted piece of scrap. He looked up at her, his eyes glazed. "The hatch. It's open," he wheezed. Karys moved toward him, but a heavy hand grabbed her ankle. Rax was crawling through the dust, his one good hand gripping her leg with the strength of a dying man. "You don't go anywhere," he wheezed. Karys looked down at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the absolute terror of a soldier who had lost his purpose and was clinging to the only order he had left. She realized then that Rax wasn't the villain. He was a victim of the same poison that had been fed to her since her first breath. "Let go, Rax," Karys said, her voice soft but firm. "The Spire doesn't want you back. They want you to die here so they can blame the humans for your death. Look at the detonator, Rax. That was a Terran-make weapon. Jackson gave it to you so the evidence would point to a human ambush. He was never going to reinstate you." Rax's grip faltered. He looked at the smoking crater where Valen had stood. He looked at the charred remains of the detonator. His eyes, once bright with violet fury, dimmed into a hollow, aching gray. "He didn't care," he muttered. "No," Karys said, kneeling beside him for a brief second. "He only cared about the war." She stood up and hauled Silas to his feet. They stumbled through the hatch and into the dark, echoing interior of the relay station. The air inside was stale, tasting of copper and old electricity. "Can you do it?" Karys asked, leaning Silas against the main console. Silas wiped blood from his eye and looked at the ancient, holographic interface. "It's a mess, Gear. The primary processors are fried, and the carrier wave is being jammed from the outside. But if I can bridge the cortex to the local satellite array, I can dump the data onto the open frequency. How long? 10 minutes if I'm lucky. 20 if I'm not." Karys looked at the door. Rax was still outside, and the other 2 strikers were beginning to recover. And beyond them, she could feel a new presence, a low rhythmic thrumming in the air that she knew all too well. "The Arbiters," she said. "They're here." Silas didn't look up from the console. "Then you better buy me those 10 minutes, your Sparky, because if this broadcast doesn't go out, we're just 2 more ghosts in a glass forest." Karys stepped back to the doorway. She retrieved her blade and stood in the center of the threshold. Her armor was cracked, her aegis was gone, and her internal power levels were critical. She was a lone vanguard standing against a machine army and her own broken brothers. But as she looked out into the basin, she didn't feel like a tool. She didn't feel like a machine. She felt like a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. The first arbiter stepped into the light of the clearing. It didn't wear a blue cloak this time. It was a skeletal frame of black chrome and red optical sensors, the true face of the Helios Syndicate's enforcers. Behind it came a dozen more, moving in perfect, terrifying unison. Rax was standing now, leaning against an obsidian pillar. He looked at the machines, then at Karys. He saw the truth in their cold red eyes. He saw the end of the lie. "Rax!" Karys shouted. "Choose!" For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The wind ceased its scream. The glass trees stopped their chiming. Rax looked at his missing arm, then at the machines that had come to finish him. With a ragged, defiant roar, Rax ignited his blade. He didn't turn it toward Karys. He turned it toward the lead arbiter. "For the Spire!" he screamed, though the words sounded like a curse rather than a prayer. He charged the line of machines, a lone, broken warrior fighting for an honor he had just realized was a shadow. Karys surged forward to join him, her silver blade cutting through the gloom. Inside the tower, Silas Vance's fingers flew across the keys, bridging the gap between two worlds that had been taught to destroy one another. 5 minutes, he whispered to the flickering screen. Just give me 5 minutes. Outside, the silver and violet light of the gene forged clashed with the cold red of the machines. The humanistic theme was no longer a theory in a cave. It was a bloody, desperate reality written in blue fluid and golden sparks. Karys Thorne was finally seeing the cost of the prejudice she had carried. It was the life of the man charging beside her, a man who had been her brother in everything but name, and who was now dying to prove that he was more than a weapon. The first arbiter fell, then the second, but the machines kept coming, their logic cold and inescapable. Karys parried a strike from a chrome limb, her ribs screaming in protest. She saw Rax disappear beneath a wave of black metal. She saw the red sensors closing in on her, and then the tower behind her began to hum. A deep, resonant pulse that shook the very foundation of the basin. The broadcast had begun. The vibration of the Valonese Junction Tower was not merely physical, it was a rhythmic pulse that resonated within the very marrow of Karys's bones. Inside the skeletal structure, the air hummed with the ionization of a massive data transmission. Outside, the world had descended into a kaleidoscope of violence. The red optical sensors of the arbiters cut through the swirling silicate dust like the eyes of predatory ghosts, while the silver and violet arcs of void glass blades carved desperate lines of defiance in the gloom. Karys Thorne stood at the threshold of the service hatch, her breath coming in ragged, shallow pulls. Her internal HUD was almost entirely dark, flickering only occasionally to display a scrolling list of critical failures. Her kinetic aegis was dead. Her primary power core was venting heat at a dangerous rate. But as she watched Rax, the man who had been her brother in 1,000 training simulations, disappear beneath a wave of black chrome and cold logic, the tactical protocols she had lived by for 22 years finally snapped. Rax, she screamed, the sound raw and unpolished, devoid of the military precision she had been taught to maintain. She didn't wait for a reply. She surged down the steps of the relay station, her blades singing a funeral dirge. She ignored the tactical calculations that told her the odds were zero. She ignored the cold voice of Commander Jackson in her memory, telling her that a soldier's only value was her survival. She was no longer a soldier. She was a woman losing a friend to a lie. She struck the first arbiter with the force of a falling star, the void glass shearing through its central chassis and sending a spray of golden sparks across the glass floor. She didn't stop to admire the kill. She spun, a whirlwind of charcoal armor and shimmering silver, hacking her way toward the pile of machines where Rax had fallen. Inside the tower, Silas Vance was hunched over the main terminal, his face illuminated by the frantic scrolling of 100 data streams. He was a man of the dirt, a scout who preferred the smell of pine needles to the ozone of a server room, but his fingers moved with a desperate, practiced grace. "Come on, you beautiful piece of junk," he hissed, his voice strained. "Just bridge the gap." The interface groaned, a series of crimson errors popping up like warning flares. The jamming signal from the syndicate was heavy, a wall of white noise designed to keep the truth in the dark. Silas reached into the console, his hands brushing against sparking wires. He didn't have the sophisticated neurolinkers of a gene forged, but he had a Pathfinder's intuition, the ability to find a path through the brush even when there was no trail. "I've got you," he whispered as the progress bar hit 80%. Just 3 more minutes. A high-frequency bolt slammed into the wall inches from his head, showering him in molten copper and dust. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He had spent his life being told that he was an insignificant speck in the grand design of the Terran remnant, a disposable cog in the gears of industry. But here, in the heart of a dying relay station, he was the only one who could stop a war. He wasn't doing it for the remnant. He was doing it for the girl outside who was currently turning herself into a human shield for a truth she had only just discovered. Karys reached Rax just as a massive arbiter, a heavy-class enforcer with 4 hydraulic limbs, prepared to drive a thermal spike into his chest. Rax was pinned, his armor cracked open, his blue biological fluid mixing with the silicate dust. He looked up at Karys, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Karys," he wheezed, "bug out." It's over. The hell it is, Karys growled. She intercepted the thermal spike with the flat of her blade, the heat of the weapon turning the air between them into a shimmering haze. The force of the impact drove her to her knees, her healing ribs groaning under the pressure. The heavy arbiter leaned in, its red sensors cycling as it processed her weakness. "You are inefficient," the machine's vocal synthesizer droned, a hollow buzzing sound that lacked even the ghost of a soul. "You protect a defective unit. I'm protecting my brother." Karys roared. She activated the emergency purge on her power core, a suicidal maneuver designed to release a localized electromagnetic pulse. It was a one-time move, something a Vanguard was only supposed to do if they were being captured or if they needed to take down a high-value target at the cost of their own life. The surge of energy erupted from her chest plate in a blinding sphere of white light. The heavy arbiter recoiled, its circuits frying, its hydraulic limbs locked in a permanent spasm. For a 30-meter radius, every machine in the basin staggered, their optical sensors going dark as the pulse scrambled their logic. Silence followed the blast, broken only by the tinkling of falling glass. Karys slumped over racks, her armor smoking, her vision fading to black at the edges. She had nothing left. No blade, no power, no protocols. She was just a girl in the rain, holding on to a dying man. Rax coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Why?" he whispered. "You were the best of us. You could have gone back." "I am back, Rax," Karys said, her voice a fragile thread. "I'm back with the truth." Inside the tower, the progress bar hit 100%. A green icon flashed on the screen. "Broadcast complete. Open frequency active." Silas let out a jagged breath, his head dropping against the console. "We did it," he muttered. "We greased the gears, Sparky." But the reprieve was short-lived. A low, thunderous roar began to fill the basin. Not the sound of the wind, but the sound of massive engines descending from the clouds. Karys looked up, her heart sinking. Descending from the gray sky were 3 heavy dropships, their hulls painted in the obsidian and silver of the spire. These weren't mercenaries. These weren't arbiters. This was the main force of the Gene Forged, led by the signature command vessel of the Obsidian Spire. "The Spire has arrived," Rax whispered, a flicker of his old indoctrination returning to his eyes. They'll save us." Karys looked at the weapons arrays on the underbelly of the lead ship as they rotated toward the relay station. They weren't powering up for a rescue. They were targeting the tower. "No, Rax," Karys said, the realization hitting her with a cold, absolute certainty. "They aren't here for us. They're here for the evidence." Silas stumbled out of the hatch, his face pale as he looked at the fleet above. "We have to move. Now! They're going to glass the whole basin." Karys tried to haul Rax up, but he shook his head, his hand falling limp in the dust. "Go, Karys. I'm KIA already. I just didn't know it until now." "Rax, no. Go," he shouted, his voice finding a final, desperate strength. "Tell the others. Tell them we aren't just gears." Silas grabbed Karys by the arm, pulling her toward the tree line. "We have to go, Karys. If we die, the broadcast was for nothing. They'll say the arbiters did it, and the story stays the same." Karys looked at Rax one last time. He gave her a small, haunting nod, a gesture of choice, the first one he had ever made. She turned and ran, her legs moving on instinct as the first volley of high-yield missiles struck the relay station. The world vanished in a roar of white heat. The tower, the machines, and Rax were swallowed by an artificial sun. The shock wave threw Karys and Silas deep into the glass forest, the silicate trees shattering around them like a billion diamonds. As Karys hit the ground, the darkness finally took her. But in the final second before she slipped away, she didn't hear the voice of Commander Jackson. She heard the chime of the glass leaves, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a funeral. It sounded like a beginning. Consciousness returned to Karys Thorne in fractured increments. First came the smell, not the sterile ozone of the spire or the metallic tang of the arbiters, but the scent of damp earth and charred wood. Then came the sound, the steady rhythmic drip of rain hitting a rusted metal surface. She opened her eyes and saw a canopy of twisted, blackened glass branches silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. She was lying in a shallow trench, covered in a thermal blanket that hummed with a low, comforting heat. "Don't try to sit up too fast," a voice said. "You've been out for about 14 hours. Your internal systems took a massive hit from that EMP burst." Karys turned her head slowly. Silas was sitting a few feet away, leaning against the remains of a shattered silicate trunk. He looked terrible. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and a jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, stitched with the same precision he had used on her ribs. "Where are we?" Karys asked, her voice a dry whisper. "About 5 kilometers south of the junction," Silas said. "We're in the ruins of an old mining colony called Sector 12. The Spire's orbital sweep missed this pocket because of the mineral density in the ground. For now, we're off the grid." Karys closed her eyes, the image of the relay station exploding flashing behind her eyelids. "Rax." Silas was silent for a long moment. "He didn't make it, Karys. Neither did the tower. But the signal went out. I've been monitoring the long-range bands on a scavenged comms unit. The broadcast hit every independent relay from here to the inner rim. The Syndicate's ledger, the mercenary contracts, Jackson's private communications, it's all out there." Karys felt a hollow ache in her chest. Was it worth it? One man's life for a few files? Silas stood up, wincing as he moved, and walked over to her. He sat on the edge of the trench, looking down at her with an expression that was no longer that of a wary Pathfinder, but of a comrade. "It wasn't just files, Karys. It was the truth. For the first time in 300 years, people are actually talking to each other instead of just shooting. There are reports of protests in the Terran colonies. Even some of your own Vanguard units are refusing to deploy until Jackson answers for the Veloni strike." He reached out and handed her a small dented metal cup. "Water," he said. "Real water. No stimulants." Karys took a sip, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She looked at her hands. The charcoal armor was scorched and pitted, the silver markings of her rank almost entirely eroded. She felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of the Spire's expectations had been stripped away along with her paint. "You said you were a ghost, Silas," she said. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant." "Being a ghost isn't so bad," Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You get to see things clearly when you aren't part of the machine." They spent the next few hours in a quiet, fragile peace, watching the rain wash the dust from the glass trees. But the peace was shattered by a sudden sharp crackle from Silas's comms unit. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Patrol Unit 7 Gamma. We are under heavy fire in Sector 12. Repeat, Sector 12. We have multiple wounded." Silas grabbed the unit, his face hardening. "That's a Terran frequency, one of the frontier patrols." "They're here?" Karys asked, her hand instinctively reaching for her blade. Silas checked his handheld scanner. "There's a skirmish happening about 2 kilometers east of here. Small arms fire, high-frequency signatures. Sounds like another Arbiter cleanup crew. They're trying to silence anyone who might have seen the dropships." Karys stood up, her armor groaning. Her systems were still only at 30%, her movements stiff and uncoordinated. "We have to go." Silas looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "Why?" "That's a human patrol, Karys. The people who were told you were a monster. The people who, 12 hours ago, you would have killed without a second thought." Karys looked at the dented cup in her hand. She thought of Silas stitching her wounds. She thought of Rax charging the machines to save a human's broadcast. She thought of the mothers in the stories who supposedly poisoned the wells, and the fathers who supposedly burned the nurseries. "Because they aren't the enemy, Silas," Karys said, her voice steady. "The lie is the enemy. And as long as we let them die alone, the lie wins." Silas stared at her for a long second, then nodded slowly. He reached into his pack and pulled out a backup pistol, checking the charge. "I guess I'm not the only one who failed my teachers." The trek through the ruins of Sector 12 was a descent into a mechanical graveyard. Rusted mining drills and skeletal transport ships lay half-buried in the glass silt, their surfaces etched with the names of miners who had died long before the war began. The sounds of combat grew louder, the sharp staccato bark of human kinetic rifles and the high-pitched hiss of arbiter bolts. They reached a ridge overlooking a small quarry. Below them, a squad of 6 human soldiers were pinned behind a collapsed shipping container. They were young, their faces pale with terror, their uniforms torn and bloodied. Surrounding them were a dozen arbiters, closing in with the cold, deliberate pace of a closing trap. "Wait for my mark," Karys whispered. She didn't have her primary power core, and her blade was flickering, but she still had the training of a Vanguard. She watched the movement of the machines, identifying the central node, an arbiter with a long-range comms array on its shoulder. "Now!" Silas opened fire from the ridge, his pistol round sparking off the arbiter's armor, drawing their attention upward. Karys didn't jump. She slid down the slope of glass silt, a silent shadow moving through the debris. She reached the first machine before it could rotate its torso, her blade sliding through its neck joint with surgical precision. The human soldiers stared in shock as a gene-forged warrior erupted into the center of the fray. For a second, one of them raised his rifle toward her, his eyes wide with the instinctive fear of 20 cycles of propaganda. "Don't shoot!" Silas screamed from the ridge, his voice echoing through the quarry. "She's with me!" The soldier hesitated, his finger trembling on the trigger. Karys didn't look at him. She spun, parrying a bolt meant for a wounded human lying on the ground. She felt the heat of the energy pass inches from her face, the ozone stinging her nostrils. "Get your wounded inside the container," she barked, the command voice of the spire resurfacing, but this time it was used to save, not to conquer. "Move, soldier!" The humans obeyed. They scrambled to pull their fallen comrades into the safety of the metal crate, while Karys and Silas held the line. It was a desperate, ugly fight. Without her aegis, Karys had to rely on speed and the environment, using the rusted mining equipment as cover. She took a hit to her shoulder plate, the force spinning her around. Another bolt grazed her thigh, melting the charcoal armor into her skin. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Every second she stayed standing was a second the humans stayed alive. Finally, the last arbiter fell, its red eye flickering out as Karys drove her blade through its chest. Silence returned to the quarry, heavy and thick with the smell of scorched metal and sweat. Karys stood in the center of the clearing, her armor smoking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at the shipping container. The human soldiers stepped out slowly, their rifles lowered. Their leader, a young woman with a corporal's stripes and a blood-stained bandage on her arm, walked toward Karys. She stopped 3 meters away, looking at the violet skin and the glowing eyes of the warrior who had just saved her life. "Why?" the corporal asked, her voice trembling. You're one of them. The spire." Karys looked at the woman. She saw the same fear she had seen in Rax's eyes before he died. She saw the same uncertainty she had felt in the cave with Silas. "I'm Karys Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "And I'm tired of being a story." The corporal looked at Silas, who was sliding down the ridge to join them. She looked at the fallen arbiters, their mechanical bodies revealing the truth of the syndicate's involvement. Slowly, with a gesture that felt like it was tearing through the very fabric of history, the human corporal extended her hand. "I'm Maya," she said. "Thank you." Karys. Karys took the hand. It was the second time she had touched a human, and this time, the heat in her chest didn't feel like a malfunction. It felt like a heartbeat. As they worked together to stabilize the wounded, gene-forged, and human side by side in the ruins of a forgotten colony, the transformation was no longer a theory. It was a bloody, painful reality. The spire still loomed on the horizon, and the Terran remnant still held its grudges. But in this small, glass-filled quarry, the war had already ended. But Karys knew that Jackson wouldn't let this stand. The broadcast had fractured the lie, but only the truth could shatter it. And for that, she would have to go back to the one place she had vowed never to return. She would have to go back to the Obsidian Spire. The Obsidian Spire did not look like a home anymore. As Karys Thorne stood on the edge of the basalt cliffs, looking across the jagged chasm at the fortress that had birthed her, it looked like a tomb. The black stone towers reached into the smog-choked sky like the fingers of a skeletal hand, and the searchlights that swept the perimeter felt like the eyes of a dying god. Beside her, Silas Vance checked the power cell on his scavenged rifle. He was pale, his movements stiff from the stitches in his side, but his gaze was fixed on the spire with a grim determination. Maya and two of her human soldiers stood behind them, their mismatched gear a stark contrast to the sleek, charcoal precision of the spire's defenses. "Are we really doing this?" Maya whispered, her breath hitching as a distant siren wailed from the ramparts. "We're 5 people against an entire legion." "We aren't against a legion," Karys said, her voice as cold and sharp as the void glass she held. "We're against one man, and the legion is already starting to wake up." The data dump from Velonis Junction had worked like a slow-acting poison. Reports from the internal Spire network, intercepted by Silas, indicated that 3 entire Vanguard units had laid down their weapons in the lower levels. The broadcast hadn't just exposed the Syndicate, it had exposed the fact that their own commander had treated their lives as currency. "We have 3 hours until the dawn sweep," Silas said, glancing at his handheld unit. "If we're going to ghost walk through the ventilation shafts, we need to move now." Karys nodded. She led them down the cliffside, moving through the shadows with the effortless grace of a predator. They didn't take the main bridge. Instead, they navigated a series of treacherous maintenance pipes that hung over the 500-meter drop of the chasm. The wind howled through the narrow gaps, threatening to tear them from the rusted metal. But Karys didn't hesitate. She felt a strange humming clarity in her mind. The doubt that had plagued her in the glass forest had hardened into a singular purpose. They entered the spire through an exhaust port in the lower smelting pits. The air here was thick with sulfur and the rhythmic thud of heavy machinery. Karys moved through the corridors she had walked 10,000 times, but every corner felt alien. She saw the murals of the Great Wars, the depictions of human cruelty and gene-forged martyrdom, and all she saw were the lies of a man who wanted a reason to keep his finger on the trigger. They reached the central elevator bank, a massive shaft of glass and steel that led directly to the commander's overlook. "Karys, wait," Silas whispered, grabbing her arm as she reached for the console. She turned, her violet eyes glowing in the dim light. "We don't have time, Silas." "I know," Silas said, his voice soft, "but you need to know, whatever happens up there, you aren't a glitch. You're the only thing in this whole damn fortress that actually works." Karys looked at the human, at the man she had been raised to despise, and felt a surge of warmth that no biostimulant could provide. "Thank you, Silas." They stepped into the elevator. The ascent was silent, the floors ticking by in agonizing slowness. 40, 50, 60. When the doors finally hissed open, they were in the overlook, a vast, circular chamber with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire northern hemisphere of Eridanos 4. Commander Jackson stood at the far end, his back to them. He was still the mountain of a man Karys remembered, his violet skin shimmering under the artificial lights, his hands clasped behind his back. "I expected you 3 hours ago, Karys," Jackson said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that showed no sign of surprise. "You were always a bit slow on the uptake when it came to tactical diversions." Karys stepped forward, her void glass blade igniting in a flash of silver. Silas, Maya, and the others fanned out, their rifles aimed at the commander. "It's over, Jackson," Karys said. "The broadcast reached the inner rim. The Syndicate is being dismantled. Your own units are standing down." Jackson turned slowly. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes glowed with a frantic, desperate intensity. "Over? Karys, we haven't even begun. You think a few leaked files change the fundamental nature of our existence? We are a species born of war. We are the masters of the stars because we have the courage to do what those soft, pink parasites cannot." He gestured toward Silas and Maya with a sneer. "You bring them here? Into my sanctum? You've been corrupted, daughter. The human toxin has reached your core. You think they love you? They're just using you to blunt the edge of the only weapon that can stop them from taking our minds." "They didn't hire the Arbiters to kill me, Jackson," Karys spat. "You did. You killed Rax. You killed Valen. You killed the only brothers I ever had." "A small price for a larger victory," Jackson said, stepping toward her. "If you had died as a martyr in the Gorge, I would have had the justification I needed to launch a full-scale strike on the Terran remnant. We would have owned this system by winter. But you had to survive. You had to be selfish." Selfish? Karys roared. I chose to see. I chose to stop being your tool. Jackson moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. He drew a heavy, matte black blade from his hip and struck. The clash of their weapons sent a shock wave of energy through the room, shattering several of the display consoles. Silas and the humans opened fire, but Jackson's personal Aegis was a high-tier military model. The kinetic rounds flattened against his shimmering shield like raindrops against glass. Keep your distance, Karys shouted to them as she parried a brutal blow from Jackson. This is my fight. The duel was a blur of violet and silver. Jackson was stronger, his strikes carrying the weight of a century of combat experience, but Karys was fueled by something he couldn't understand. She wasn't fighting for the spire or for the glory of the Gene Forged. She was fighting for the memory of Rax, for the stitches in her side, and for the right to choose her own path. They traded blows across the overlook, the sound of their blades like claps of thunder. Karys felt her armor cracking, her internal system screaming in protest, but she didn't slow down. She saw an opening, a fraction of a second where Jackson overextended his reach. She didn't strike for his heart. She struck for the power coupling on his Aegis generator. The void glass sliced through the metal housing, and Jackson's shield vanished in a spray of blue sparks. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. Karys followed up with a spinning kick to his chest, sending him crashing into the central command table. She stood over him, her blade at his throat, her breath coming in heavy, jagged gasps. Outside the windows, the first rays of dawn were beginning to break over the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and gold. Kill me then, Jackson wheezed, a bloody smile touching his lips. Finish the story, Karys. Show them that even the enlightened Vanguard is just a killer in a different coat. Karys looked at the man who had shaped her entire world. She saw the monster she had been taught to be, and she saw the man who had invented the monster to satisfy his own greed. She felt the cold, familiar pull of the Spire's logic, the urge to end the threat, to balance the ledger, to settle the score in blood. But then she felt Silas's hand on her shoulder. He didn't say a word, but the warmth of his touch was enough. Karys lowered her blade. No, she said, her voice quiet and steady. I'm not finishing your story, Jackson. I'm starting mine. She turned away from him and looked at the console. Silas, open the gates, all of them, and patch me into the internal and external comms grids. Every speaker on Eridanus 4. Silas nodded, his fingers flying across the keys. You're live, Sparky. Karys took a deep breath. She didn't speak as a soldier. She didn't speak as a vanguard. She spoke as a survivor. This is Karys Thorne, she said, her voice echoing through the spire, through the human colonies and across the silent forests of glass. The war was a lie. The hatred was a script. We were told we were enemies so we wouldn't see the hands in our pockets. But today the spire is open. The humans are here, not as invaders, but as witnesses. She looked out at the horizon, where a fleet of human scout ships was beginning to descend, not with weapons hot, but with signaling lights of peace. The choice is yours, she continued. You can stay in the dark, or you can step into the light. But the stories end today. The weeks that followed the opening of the spire were a chaotic, messy, and beautiful struggle. The peace was not a sudden, magical event. It was a series of difficult conversations, of hesitant handshakes, and of the slow, painful dismantling of 3 centuries of fortified walls. The obsidian spire remained, but its purpose had shifted. It was no longer a fortress. It was a summit. Human pathfinders and gene-forged strikers worked together to clear the last of the arbiter cells from the wilderness. The Syndicate's assets were seized, and the wealth that had been used to fuel the war was redirected into the restoration of the planet's atmosphere and the cleaning of the northern aquifers. Karys Thorne sat on the high ramparts of the spire, the same place she had stood 12 cycles ago as a fledgling warrior. The air was cleaner now, the smog replaced by a crisp, cold breeze that carried the scent of growing things. She looked down at her hands. They were scarred, the violet skin marked by the battles she had fought. But they were no longer shaking. She was no longer wearing the charcoal armor of a vanguard. She wore a simple, rugged vest of human make and the silver-inlaid trousers of her own people. Silas walked up behind her, 2 cups of steaming liquid in his hands. He looked better, the color back in his face, though he still walked with a slight limp. "Coffee?" he asked, offering her a cup. "Real stuff this time. No pine needles." Karys took it, the warmth of familiar comfort. "Thank you, Silas." "How is the transition going in the lower levels?" Silas asked, leaning his elbows on the stone railing. "Hard," Karys admitted. "Some of the older veterans still can't look a human in the eye without reaching for a blade. But the young ones, they're curious. They're asking questions." "Maya says the first joint trade caravan reached the southern rim yesterday without a single shot fired." Silas nodded, looking out at the sunset. "It's a start. 100 years of fighting doesn't wash away in a month, but at least the water's clean." Karys looked at the horizon, where the lights of a new human settlement were beginning to twinkle in the distance. She felt a profound sense of stillness, a quietude she had never known in the Spire. She realized that for 22 years, she had been running a race that had no finish line, driven by a fear that had no face. She took a slow sip of the coffee and let her mind wander back over the journey, the ambush in the gorge, the cave in the glass forest, the explosion at Velonis, and the final confrontation with Jackson. She thought about Rax and the strange, quiet dignity in his final moments. "I spent so much of my life being terrified of being broken," Karys thought, her mind drifting into a deep, reflective space. "I was raised to believe that any flaw, any doubt, any flicker of empathy was a sign of a system failure. I thought that to be strong, I had to be a monolith, a singular piece of obsidian that nothing could crack. But as I look at the stars now, I realize that it was the cracks that saved me. It was the doubt that allowed the truth to seep in. It was the pain that proved I was alive. I used to hate humans because I was told they were soft, but now I see that their softness is their greatest strength. It's the ability to bend without breaking, to forgive when it would be easier to strike, and to choose a stranger over a legacy. I'm not the perfect soldier anymore, and I'm not the daughter of the Spire. I am something new, something unwritten. I am a woman who knows that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy isn't a void glass blade or an arbiter's bolt. It's a story. And for the first time in my life, I am the one holding the pen." She looked at Silas, who was watching her with a quiet, knowing smile. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking about the forest," Karys said. "I think I'd like to go back there. To the glass forest. Not to hide, but to see it. Just once, without a mission." Silas reached out and squeezed her hand. "I think I can find the way. I am a Pathfinder after all." Karys smiled. A real smile. One that reached her eyes and softened the hard lines of her face. "I know you are, Silas." They stood together on the ramparts as the twin moons of Eridanus IV began to rise, their silver light reflecting in the glass trees far below. The planet was still scarred, and the peace was still fragile. But as the wind whispered through the spires, it no longer carried the sound of horns or war cries. It carried the sound of a choice. I spent years carrying that anger like a suit of armor, only to realize it was a prison that kept the world away. It made me feel safe, but it also made me feel alone. I wonder, is there a story you have been told your whole life about someone or something you were supposed to hate? What would happen if you decided to put that armor down, just for a moment, and look at them with your own eyes? Karys took a final sip of her coffee and watched the stars. The void was no longer a cold, empty place. It was a canvas, and she was finally ready to paint.